Before we venture into what may be the most complex and haunting investigation I've ever undertaken into the hidden supernatural crimes of 19th century New Orleans, I want to personally welcome each of you who has chosen to join me on this journey into one of America's most carefully buried occult conspiracies, whether you're watching this from the bustling energy of a modern city or the peaceful quiet of a small town, whether it's your morning ritual with coffee or your late-night dive into history's darkest mysteries. Your presence here creates a connection that spans continents and time zones. Please take a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It helps me understand the incredible global community we're building as we uncover these forgotten chapters of American supernatural history. What I'm about to reveal began with a discovery so extraordinary that it challenged everything historians thought they knew about the intersection of voodoo practice, criminal enterprise, and political power in Reconstruction-era New Orleans. In August 2020, during the demolition of a condemned building in the historic Tremé neighborhood, construction workers uncovered a hidden basement that had been sealed for over 125 years. Inside this underground chamber, they found what can only be described as a supernatural laboratory, complete with hundreds of preserved specimens in glass jars, detailed anatomical drawings of human organs annotated with mystical symbols, and most disturbing of all, a collection of leather-bound journals documenting the systematic harvesting of human souls for what the authors called the ultimate conjure work. The journals, written in an elegant mixture of French, Creole, and what experts have identified as various West African dialects, covered a period from 1889 to 1895 and detailed practices that went far beyond traditional voodoo healing or spiritual work. These documents revealed a sophisticated operation run by a group of women who called themselves Les Sœurs de l'Ombre, the Sisters of Shadow, who had developed techniques for literally extracting and preserving human souls, which they then used to power supernatural workings of unprecedented scope and malevolence. The final entry, dated December 21, 1895, simply stated, "The great work is complete, the city belongs to us now, let those who come after beware the price of our victory." It was signed by three names, Madame Lavinia Trosclair, Madame Celeste Boudreau, and Madame Marie-Claire Dufresne. This discovery would prove to be the key to understanding a series of mysterious deaths, political upheavals, and supernatural phenomena that had plagued New Orleans during the 1890s but had been dismissed by historians as coincidence or the product of superstitious minds. The Sisters of Shadow had operated at the very heart of the city's voodoo community while secretly developing practices so dark and powerful that they had effectively gained supernatural control over New Orleans' political and economic elite, using harvested souls to create what amounted to an invisible empire built on occult terror and spiritual slavery. To understand the full scope and horror of what the Sisters of Shadow accomplished during their years of operation, we must first immerse ourselves completely in the New Orleans of 1892, a city where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, the living and the dead, the sacred and profane were more permeable than anywhere else in America. New Orleans in 1892 was a metropolis of approximately 242,000 residents, making it the largest city in the South and a crucial center of American commerce, but these numbers barely hint at the unique spiritual ecosystem that made the city a perfect breeding ground for the kind of supernatural criminality that the Sisters would perfect. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River's crescent bend like a fever dream made manifest in brick and iron, built on land that was technically below sea level and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of tension between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The climate was subtropical and oppressive, with summers that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made the air feel thick as soup. The yellow fever epidemics that had devastated the city throughout the 1870s and 1880s had only recently subsided, leaving behind a population that had developed an intimate relationship with death and a corresponding fascination with the supernatural forces that seemed to govern the boundary between life and mortality. The Tremé neighborhood, where our story unfolds, was the cultural and spiritual heart of New Orleans' Free People of Color community, a vibrant district that had been home to generations of Creole families, skilled artisans, and the most powerful voodoo practitioners in the Americas. Founded in the early 19th century on land that had once been the Morin plantation, Tremé had developed its own unique culture that blended African spiritual traditions, Catholic mysticism, and Caribbean folk practices into a sophisticated system of supernatural knowledge that attracted seekers from around the world. The streets of Tremé in 1892 were lined with Creole cottages and shotgun houses painted in bright colors that seemed to glow in the perpetual twilight created by the massive live oak trees that formed a canopy over the entire neighborhood. The air was filled with the sounds of music, conversation in multiple languages, and the constant underlying rhythm of drums that seemed to pulse like the heartbeat of some vast, invisible entity. The smell of cooking food, burning incense, and exotic herbs created an olfactory landscape that was unlike anything found elsewhere in America. The economic foundation of Tremé rested on a complex network of legitimate and semi-legitimate enterprises that served both the local community and the broader New Orleans population. Skilled craftsmen produced furniture, ironwork, and other goods that were prized throughout the South, while musicians, dancers, and other entertainers provided services for the city's thriving entertainment industry. But perhaps more important than any conventional business was the neighborhood's role as the center of New Orleans' supernatural economy, where voodoo practitioners, fortune tellers, and conjure workers provided services that ranged from healing and protection to love spells and curses. The voodoo community in 1892 New Orleans was organized around a complex hierarchy of practitioners, with the most powerful being the Mambo Asagui, or high priestesses, who claimed direct communication with the Lua, the spirits that governed all aspects of human existence. These women wielded enormous influence not only within the African American community but throughout New Orleans society, as even the most respectable white citizens would quietly seek their services when conventional medicine or religion failed to provide solutions to their problems. At the apex of this spiritual hierarchy were the three women who would become known as the Sisters of Shadow, each of whom had established herself as a legitimate and respected voodoo practitioner before embarking on the dark path that would ultimately consume them. Madame Lavinia Trosclair was perhaps the most publicly prominent of the three, operating a shop on Esplanade Avenue that sold herbs, charms, and other spiritual supplies to clients from across the South. Born in Haiti around 1845, she claimed to be a direct descendant of the legendary voodoo queen Sanite Belair and possessed a reputation for supernatural abilities that extended far beyond New Orleans. Contemporary descriptions of Madame Trosclair, found in letters, diary entries, and newspaper accounts discovered in various archives, paint her as a woman of extraordinary presence and undeniable charisma. She was described as tall and regal, with skin the color of burnished copper, eyes that seemed to change color depending on her mood, and an aura of power that made even skeptics uncomfortable in her presence. She spoke at least 7 languages fluently and was said to be equally comfortable discussing philosophy with university professors or conducting healing rituals for illiterate laborers. Madame Celeste Boudreau, the second member of the triumvirate, operated from a more secretive base in the heart of Tremé, where she maintained what was ostensibly a boarding house for women but was actually a training center for young voodoo practitioners who came from across the Caribbean to study under her guidance. Born in New Orleans around 1850 to a family that had been practicing voodoo for generations, she possessed what contemporary accounts described as an almost supernatural ability to see into people's souls and understand their deepest fears and desires. Madame Marie-Claire Dufresne, the youngest of the three at approximately 35 years old in 1892, was perhaps the most intellectually sophisticated member of the group. She had been educated in Paris and spoke fluent French, Spanish, English, and several African languages, allowing her to study voodoo practices from around the world and synthesize them into new and more powerful techniques. She operated what appeared to be a legitimate medical practice, serving as a midwife and healer for the Tremé community while secretly developing the anatomical knowledge that would prove crucial to the sisters' most horrific innovations. The transformation of these three respected practitioners into the Sisters of Shadow appears to have begun in 1889, when a series of personal tragedies and professional setbacks convinced them that conventional voodoo practice was insufficient to protect them and their community from the increasing pressures of Jim Crow laws, economic exploitation, and racial violence that were reshaping the post-Reconstruction South. The journals found in the hidden basement reveal that they had concluded that only the most extreme measures could provide them with the power necessary to protect their people and maintain their position in an increasingly hostile world. The first experiments in what they called soul harvesting began in the winter of 1889, when the sisters started working with terminally ill patients who volunteered to participate in rituals that they believed would preserve their spiritual essence after death. The early procedures, as described in Madame Dufresne's meticulous notes, involved complex ceremonies that took place at the moment of death and used a combination of traditional voodoo techniques and anatomical procedures that she had developed through her medical practice. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1890, when the sisters successfully extracted and preserved what they believed to be the complete soul of a young woman who had died of consumption. The preserved essence, contained in a specially prepared crystal vessel, apparently retained the consciousness and memories of the deceased and could be communicated with through elaborate ritual procedures. More importantly, the harvested soul could be used to power supernatural workings of unprecedented scope and effectiveness. The success of this initial experiment led the sisters to expand their operations, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for soul extraction and preservation while building a network of clients who were willing to pay enormous sums for the supernatural services that harvested souls could provide. The journals document the development of procedures for extracting souls from living victims, techniques for preserving multiple souls in single containers, and methods for using harvested spiritual essence to power curses, love spells, and other supernatural workings that were far more powerful than anything achievable through traditional voodoo practice. The victim selection process reveals a systematic approach that prioritized individuals who possessed what the sisters called spiritual potency, a quality that seemed to correlate with intelligence, creativity, and emotional intensity rather than conventional measures of social status or physical health. The primary targets were artists, musicians, writers, and other creative individuals whose souls were believed to contain concentrated spiritual energy that could power the most ambitious supernatural workings. The sisters had developed an elaborate system for identifying and approaching potential victims, often using their legitimate practices as cover for surveillance and recruitment operations. They would spend months studying potential targets, learning about their personal lives, financial situations, and spiritual beliefs before approaching them with offers of healing, protection, or other services that would provide opportunities for the soul extraction procedures. The extraction process itself, as described in horrifying detail in Madame Dufresne's medical notes, involved keeping victims alive while gradually separating their spiritual essence from their physical bodies through a combination of drugs, surgical procedures, and ritual techniques that had been developed through years of experimentation. The victims were kept in a drugged state that prevented them from understanding what was happening while maintaining their consciousness long enough for the extraction to be completed. The preserved souls were stored in the basement laboratory in specially prepared crystal vessels that had been blessed through elaborate rituals and inscribed with symbols that the sisters claimed would maintain the spiritual integrity of the harvested essence. The laboratory contained hundreds of these vessels, each labeled with the name, date of extraction, and spiritual characteristics of the soul it contained, creating what amounted to a supernatural library of human consciousness. The applications for harvested souls were limited only by the sisters' imagination and ambition. The journals document their use in creating curses that could cause death, madness, or financial ruin in victims who were thousands of miles away, love spells that could compel absolute devotion from unwilling targets, and protection rituals that made the sisters and their allies virtually immune to conventional forms of attack or investigation. But perhaps most ambitious of all was what the sisters called the Great Work, a systematic campaign to gain supernatural control over New Orleans' political and economic elite through the strategic placement of harvested souls in positions of power and influence. The journals reveal that they had successfully placed soul-controlled individuals in key positions throughout city government, the police department, the court system, and major businesses, creating an invisible network of supernatural influence that allowed them to manipulate events throughout the city. The scope of this supernatural conspiracy was extraordinary, with the sisters apparently controlling mayors, judges, police chiefs, and business leaders who had no conscious awareness that their decisions were being influenced by harvested souls that had been bound to their spiritual essence through elaborate ritual procedures. The journals document specific instances where the sisters used this network to influence elections, prevent investigations of their activities, and eliminate rivals or threats to their operation. The financial success of the sisters' operation was equally impressive, with the journals showing that they were earning the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money through their supernatural services. Wealthy clients from across the United States and Europe traveled to New Orleans to purchase curses, love spells, and other supernatural workings that could not be obtained anywhere else in the world. The sisters invested their profits in real estate, legitimate businesses, and political influence, creating a financial empire that complemented their supernatural power. The protection that allowed the sisters to operate with virtual impunity came from their supernatural control over law enforcement and political officials, but it was reinforced by the genuine fear that their reputation inspired throughout New Orleans. Even people who didn't believe in voodoo understood that crossing the sisters could result in mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, or financial disasters that seemed to strike with supernatural precision. The beginning of the end for the Sisters of Shadow came in the fall of 1894, when a young Catholic priest named Father Antoine Dubois arrived in New Orleans from France with a mission to investigate what the Vatican had identified as dangerous occult practices that were threatening the spiritual welfare of the city's Catholic population. Father Dubois had been trained in what the Church called spiritual warfare, and possessed both the knowledge and the spiritual authority necessary to combat supernatural forces that were beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Unlike previous attempts to investigate the sisters, Father Dubois' approach was purely spiritual rather than legal or political. He began by conducting what he called spiritual reconnaissance, extended periods of prayer and meditation that allowed him to identify the supernatural forces at work in Tremé without directly confronting them. His letters to his superiors in Rome, copies of which were found in the Vatican's secret archives, describe his growing horror at what he discovered. "The evil that has taken root in this neighborhood," Father Dubois wrote in a letter dated November 15, 1894, "exceeds anything described in our most ancient texts on demonology. These women have not merely made pacts with dark forces, they have learned to harvest and enslave human souls, creating an abomination that threatens the very foundation of Christian civilization. The spiritual atmosphere of the entire city has been corrupted by their practices, and I fear that without immediate intervention, their influence will spread beyond New Orleans to contaminate the entire region." Father Dubois' investigation revealed that the sisters' power came not from traditional demonic possession but from their systematic enslavement of human souls that had been prevented from passing on to their eternal reward or punishment. His letters describe a spiritual ecosystem that had been fundamentally altered by the presence of hundreds of trapped souls that were being used as supernatural batteries to power workings of unprecedented scope and malevolence. The confrontation between Father Dubois and the Sisters of Shadow began in December 1894, when the priests started conducting public exorcism rituals in Congo Square, directly challenging their authority and attempting to free the enslaved souls that powered their supernatural empire. The journals record the sisters' growing fury at what they saw as an invasion of their spiritual territory and their attempts to use increasingly powerful curses to drive the priest away or kill him outright. But Father Dubois proved to be protected by spiritual forces that were apparently stronger than those the sisters commanded. His letters describe several attempts on his life through supernatural means, mysterious illnesses that struck him during important rituals, accidents that should have been fatal but left him unharmed, and direct attacks by what he described as enslaved spirits that were repelled by his prayers and holy relics. The final confrontation took place on December 21, 1895, the winter solstice, when the sisters had planned to complete their great work by permanently binding the harvested souls to the spiritual fabric of New Orleans itself, creating a supernatural foundation that would give them eternal control over the city. According to Father Dubois' detailed account, found among his papers in the archives of the Archdiocese of New Orleans, he entered the sisters' basement laboratory at midnight, armed only with a crucifix, holy water, and a relic of Saint Michael the Archangel that had been blessed by Pope Leo XIII himself. What he found in the underground chamber defied description even in his carefully detailed report. The sisters were in the midst of what he called the ultimate abomination, a ritual that involved the simultaneous release of all the harvested souls in their collection, not to free them but to bind them permanently to the spiritual essence of New Orleans itself. The procedure involved complex geometric patterns drawn in human blood, hundreds of burning candles arranged according to astrological calculations, and the three sisters themselves serving as living conduits for spiritual forces that Father Dubois described as beyond human comprehension. The battle that followed, as described in Father Dubois' report, was fought on both physical and spiritual planes, with the priest using the full power of Catholic ritual to combat forces that manifested as everything from invisible attackers to supernatural fire that burned without consuming anything physical. The confrontation lasted until dawn, when Father Dubois' prayers apparently succeeded in breaking the spiritual bonds that held the harvested souls in captivity, allowing them to pass on to their eternal destinations and destroying the supernatural foundation of the sisters' power. The immediate result was the complete spiritual collapse of the sisters themselves, as their bodies, which had been sustained by harvested soul energy for years, suddenly reverted to their natural condition. Father Dubois' report describes their transformation from apparently middle-aged women to what appeared to be ancient crones, their hair turning white, their skin becoming wrinkled and spotted, and their eyes losing the supernatural fire that had made them so compelling. But rather than dying, the sisters simply vanished, disappearing from the chamber while Father Dubois was conducting the final prayers that would consecrate the space and prevent its future use for occult purposes. The priest's search of the laboratory revealed that they had apparently taken nothing with them except a small collection of the most powerful harvested souls, suggesting that they retained enough supernatural ability to continue their practices elsewhere, though on a much reduced scale. Father Dubois' subsequent investigation of the laboratory revealed the full scope of the sisters' crimes. In addition to the hundreds of harvested souls found in the crystal vessels, forensic examination of the chamber uncovered evidence that at least 200 people had been killed in the basement over the 6-year period of the sisters' operation. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 70 and included people of all races and social classes, suggesting that the sisters had been completely indiscriminate in their selection of targets once their operation had reached full scale. The political and social aftermath of the sisters' exposure was carefully managed by church and city officials who understood that the full truth would destroy New Orleans' reputation and potentially trigger widespread panic about supernatural threats. The official story, reported in the newspapers, was that police had uncovered a criminal conspiracy involving fraud and extortion, with no mention of the supernatural elements or the systematic murder of hundreds of innocent people. The surviving victims of the sisters' supernatural influence were quietly treated by church officials trained in spiritual healing, and the physical evidence was either destroyed or hidden in church archives where it would remain secret for over a century, but the psychological and spiritual impact on New Orleans was profound and lasting. The voodoo community, which had been a respected part of the city's cultural landscape, found itself under suspicion and persecution as authorities cracked down on all forms of occult practice. Many legitimate practitioners fled the city, while others went underground, practicing their religion in secret and avoiding the kind of public prominence that had made the sisters so dangerous. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond New Orleans to influence American attitudes toward alternative religious practices and the supernatural in general. Father Dubois detailed reports, which were circulated among Catholic clergy throughout the United States, helped establish the Church's official position on occult practices and provided a template for identifying and combating what were deemed to be genuinely demonic influences. From a criminological perspective, the Sisters of Shadow case represents one of the most sophisticated and long-lasting examples of occult-motivated serial killing in American history. The systematic nature of their murders, the elaborate spiritual framework that surrounded each killing, and the use of harvested souls to build a supernatural criminal empire established patterns that would be seen in other occult-motivated crimes throughout American history. The psychological analysis of the sisters themselves, based on the detailed self-documentation found in their journals, reveals a complex group dynamic that allowed normal human relationships to coexist with systematic murder and spiritual enslavement. The fact that 3 intelligent and educated women could convince themselves that their horrific crimes were justified by spiritual necessity demonstrates the dangerous intersection of religious extremism and criminal behavior that continues to manifest in various forms today. The supernatural elements of the case remain the most controversial and difficult to analyze from a modern perspective, while contemporary skeptics dismiss the accounts of soul harvesting and supernatural control as either fraud or mass hysteria. The consistency of witness testimony across multiple sources and the physical evidence found in the laboratory suggest that something genuinely inexplicable was taking place in the basement of that Tremé building. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a professor of religious studies at Tulane University who has spent years studying the case, argues that whether or not the sisters actually possessed the supernatural abilities they claimed is less important than understanding how their reputation for such powers allowed them to manipulate and control their victims and the broader community. The real horror of the Sisters of Shadow case, Dr. Thornton explains, is not whether they could actually harvest souls, but how their claims to such abilities created a climate of fear that enabled them to commit very real murders with virtual impunity while building a criminal empire that reached into every level of New Orleans society. The international implications of the case also deserve consideration, as the sisters' practices drew on spiritual traditions from Africa, Haiti, and other parts of the Caribbean that had been suppressed or driven underground by colonial authorities. Their ability to synthesize these traditions into a powerful system of supernatural terrorism suggests that the forced diaspora of African peoples had not destroyed their spiritual knowledge but had instead created new and potentially dangerous combinations of ancient practices. The role of corruption in enabling the sisters' operation cannot be overstated, as the case reveals how supernatural fear could be used to compromise officials who might otherwise have been immune to conventional forms of bribery or intimidation. The journals document several instances where the sisters used harvested souls to compel cooperation from people who had no financial incentive to protect them, suggesting that supernatural coercion could be even more effective than conventional forms of corruption. The impact on the victims' families and the broader community was devastating and long-lasting. Many of the families who lost members to the sisters' rituals never learned the truth about what had happened, as the official cover-up meant that their loved ones were simply listed as missing persons or victims of the various diseases and accidents that plagued 19th-century urban life. The psychological trauma of not knowing what had happened to their family members was compounded by the supernatural fear that continued to surround any discussion of the case. The preservation of the evidence in the sealed laboratory raises important questions about the relationship between secrecy and justice. Father Dubois' decision to seal the chamber rather than expose the full truth was motivated by his belief that public knowledge of the sisters' practices would cause panic and potentially inspire imitators. But it also meant that the victims' families were denied closure and that the broader community never fully understood the scope of the crimes that had been committed in their midst. The discovery of the laboratory in 2020 has reignited interest in the case and raised new questions about how such crimes should be investigated and prosecuted. The physical evidence, including the crystal vessels and ritual implements, has been subjected to modern forensic analysis that has confirmed many of the details recorded in the historical documents, but it has also revealed aspects of the sisters' practices that were not fully understood by 19th-century investigators. The case continues to influence contemporary discussions about religious freedom, the boundaries of acceptable spiritual practice, and the role of law enforcement in investigating crimes that involve supernatural beliefs. Legal scholars point to the Sisters of Shadow case as an early example of the challenges that arise when criminal behavior is motivated by or justified through religious beliefs, an issue that remains relevant in contemporary cases involving religious extremism. The psychological impact of the case extends beyond the immediate victims to include the investigators, clergy, and community members who were exposed to evidence of the sisters' practices. Father Dubois' later writings reveal that he struggled with what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life, and several other people who were involved in the investigation reportedly suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and other psychological symptoms that persisted for years. The broader cultural impact of the case can be seen in its influence on American folklore and popular culture, as elements of the sisters' story have been incorporated into countless works of fiction, film, and television that deal with supernatural themes. However, these fictional adaptations have often obscured the very real human tragedy at the heart of the case, turning the systematic murder of hundreds of innocent people into entertainment that trivializes the suffering of the victims and their families. As we reflect on the story of the Sisters of Shadow and their reign of supernatural terror in 1890s New Orleans, we must grapple with uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the power of belief, and the vulnerability of communities to charismatic individuals who claim to possess special knowledge or abilities. The case reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who can convince their victims that their suffering serves a higher purpose, whether that purpose is spiritual, political, or ideological. The courage shown by Father Dubois in confronting the sisters, despite the very real danger to his own life and soul, serves as a powerful reminder that evil can only triumph when good people choose to remain silent or inactive. His willingness to risk everything to stop their crimes, even when the supernatural elements of the case challenged his own understanding of reality, demonstrates the kind of moral courage that is necessary to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. The legacy of the Sisters of Shadow continues to influence how we understand the intersection of religion, crime, and mental illness, providing insights that remain relevant to contemporary investigations of cult-related crimes and other cases where spiritual beliefs are used to justify violence. The systematic documentation that the sisters themselves provided of their crimes offers a unique window into the minds of killers who saw themselves as spiritual warriors rather than criminals, revealing the psychological mechanisms that allow people to commit horrific acts while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness. Today, as we continue to grapple with religious extremism, cult violence, and other forms of ideologically motivated crime, the story of the Sisters of Shadow provides both warning and guidance. It shows us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who combine genuine charisma and intelligence with complete moral corruption, and that the communities most at risk are those where traditional authority structures have been weakened or where people are desperate enough to seek help from anyone who claims to have answers. The preservation of the evidence from the Sisters' laboratory serves as a reminder that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to suppress it, and that the victims of even the most horrific crimes deserve to have their stories told and their suffering acknowledged. The fact that these documents remained hidden for over 125 years before being discovered by accident suggests that there may be other similar cases waiting to be uncovered, other victims whose stories have been lost to history but whose evidence remains buried in the hidden corners of our cities. As you reflect on this story, I encourage you to consider how the dynamics that enabled the Sisters of Shadow's crimes continue to operate in our world today. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're aware of similar cases or unexplained disappearances in your own community's history, please consider sharing that information as well. Only by bringing these hidden histories to light can we hope to prevent future tragedies and honor the memory of those who suffered in darkness for far too long. The story of the Sisters of Shadow reminds us that evil often wears the mask of spirituality, that the most dangerous predators are those who claim to offer salvation, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our deepest fears and most desperate hopes for their own twisted purposes. In remembering their victims, we commit ourselves to ensuring that such horrors never again find fertile ground in the shadows of our communities.